Hello everyone, welcome back to another video, and today is going to be different because we've lost a legend a month ago, Steve Albini. He died of a heart attack on May 7th, 2024, and to honor such a giant force in music, I'm going to dedicate a huge video for him to educate the people on why he is so great. So, I'm mainly going to talk about his bands and not the records he produced, because that could be a whole other video to itself, and I feel like people know the albums he actually engineered, not produced, he ain't producer, but albums he engineered more than the bands that he was in. So first, first let's get into Big Black, my favorite Albini band. If you want a good reason why Steve was very influential, I will point you onto this band, because Big Black, back in the 80s, it was basically its own thing because of the abrasiveness and distinctness of the band's sound, which basically kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of future genres. Let's say like industrial, with the drum machine usage, and that being a pinnacle part of, that genre, and grunge, because, noise rock, it's like Scratch Acid and Butthole Surfers kind of paved the way for grunge. And they also kind of like, speaking of those bands, they basically had their own version of noise, and that noise is very ferocious and very ear-grating. That's because like the guitar picks were made of like metal, and that causes the instruments to sound like someone is actually like scraping on a piece of metal, mainly the guitars. And the band gained the reputation to sound, basically, from one quote I think from an article, is that they sound like a bunch of construction instruments playing in a, like the instruments sound like construction instruments, and that's not really far off, but it's a really like a sound that would make your ears bleed. And the drum machine that I mentioned earlier, it makes it work even more because it brings more rhythm in and makes the band's chaotic sound kind of like come together. And also, my favorite part of this band, I think, is the very disturbing and controversial lyrical content, which kind of makes the music even more deranged. And the content in general, like, talks about the very harsh and heinous taboo things of human society. I mean, for the 80s, like, not really like now, but still bad, but it's not really taboo now. Like, examples would be like pedophilia, rape, domestic abuse, racism, to name a few. So, to start with Big Black, I would pick their album Songs About Fucking, because I feel like it's the most accessible album of theirs. It's not really like the right word to describe it, and I feel like the songs have less care than, and like, quality to their best work. Like, it's way more longer, and just the album to me is just very like long and just overdone, and it's just like the songs at the end don't really catch my attention. But speaking of their best work, you should hit up Racer X and Atomizer, because it's basically like their peak. And Atomizer is basically their greatest achievement, and Racer X is just their early sound, just polished. So those two are the most essential albums in the Big Black discography. So, with that out of the way, next up is the band Albini, formed right after Big Black broke up. And I can't say the name because of, the YouTube demonetization. But just look up the album Two Nuns and a Pack Mule on YouTube, and you'll see basically what kind of I mean. But this band is a little bit different from Big Black. One, it's basically a supergroup where the drummer and bassist of Scratch Acid joining. And two, speaking of which, the band actually has a drummer this time. And three, the Scratch Acid guys brought some of their sound with them, so it sounds basically a little bit more noisier. This was a pretty solid idea for a band, I would say, considering how little of a lifespan it had. But the only qualm I have with this band is that the drums stand out more than the other instruments in the mix throughout the album. I feel like for this to work, they should have mixed the drums a little lower, but the rest is still pretty good. It's basically kind of like Big Black with an actual drummer, and the drummer is like Ray Washington is a great drummer, and his drum sound is very raw and biting. I still like it. It's cool, but it's kind of weird because I feel like this shows that adding drums, like, it's a really neat experiment because it shows that adding drums makes the Big Black sound completely different. So since this band's discography is so short, I will start with their only full-length album, Two Nuns and a Pack Mule. And speaking of completely different, let's talk about the band Shellac. Shellac's sound, I feel, evolved through their first three albums. Their first album, at Action Park, is mainly a post-hardcore sound. I feel it really nails it home. It's very booming and loud and turns every element of post-hardcore to a 10. And I feel like it's like a really essential one as well, along with like the greats. But the only thing that brings it down is I feel like it's mostly samey riff-wise. Like at some points, I definitely felt like I was listening to the same riff. Like on songs like Songs About Minerals, it sounded like the riff of At Action Park. But speaking of samey, that is not what their next kind of evolution of sound is. That's what kind of like what Terraform is. This album leans into a math rock sound, and I feel like each song is a new experience, displaying different time signatures and using them in a very constructive way. And adding Steve's sense of humor makes every second on this album very distinct. My only negative with this album is how the tracks are placed. Didn't You Deserve is a slow, lengthy, boring way to start an album, but it really takes weird balls to start an album like this, and I kind of weirdly respect that. Because I still can't, even though after listening to Terraform, let's say like, I think I listened to it like more than 10 times, I still can't get through Didn't You Deserve. Like, it's way too long. And I've heard somewhere that, like, this album concept is that the tracks are in reverse, and that makes so much sense, because Copper is such a much better opener. Because, and like, they all, like, sync well together as well, like, reversed. So, if that is this album's concept, then sure, I guess it's interesting, but kind of not really a smart way to go without an album. Okay, so next, remember when I said that this band's sound evolved through their first three albums? Well, I think they truly found themselves and reached a peak at 1000 Hertz. 1000 Hertz does a nice little fusion dance with the last two records, combining them into a delicate, powerful final form. Each song is a standout. They all synergize with each other. It's like the songs on 1000 Hertz kind of, it's like Cartoon Network in the early 2000s. Like, it's just hit after hit after hit after hit. And the styles of this album, of the last two albums, it really combines them both really well, and they're really done with justice. They are also paced really well. They both flow well without it being forced. It's just a really solid album. And they kind of follow this formula for the rest of their discography. And they all, not as the same as 1000 Hertz, but I feel like they just like really like nailed their sound. Like nailed it, like hit it out of the park, as they would say. So even like their last album that came out like last month. So yeah, like they obviously found themselves. So absolutely, I would say start with 1,000 Hertz. And so yeah, that's it for my guide to get you to get you to know about Steve Albini. If you enjoyed this special guide, I'd really encourage you to listen to all of his music and the records he engineered, and to not only pay respects, but to learn about one of the most essential people in music history. So, see you guys, and RIP Steve Albini.